The joke that destroyed a $400 million firm started with my MBA application. I am Michael Richardson, 44 years old, Chief Compliance Officer, 20 years inside securities regulation, and apparently too old to study again. The rooftop party overlooked downtown Seattle like every expensive corporate illusion I had spent 2 decades protecting from regulators. Glass walls, blue lighting, junior analysts pretending exhaustion was ambition. Executives drinking 12-year-old bourbon while discussing fiduciary responsibility like it was a branding strategy. Summit Financial Advisors had just closed its largest quarter in company history. Patricia Sullivan stood near the investor group, smiling for photographs. Dylan Sullivan moved between tables, shaking hands like he already owned the next decade. Then Madison Sullivan saw my Northwestern Kellogg folder sitting beside my jacket. Everything changed after that. And Master of Business Administration at your age is aggressive. That was the first sentence she said loudly enough for nearby analysts to hear. People laughed carefully, not because it was funny, because she was Patricia's niece. I stayed calm. Madison picked up the folder like evidence during a trial. She smiled at the crowd before looking back at me with the kind of confidence that only exists inside protected families. You are already a compliance officer. Why are you trying to reinvent yourself now? The rooftop became quieter around us. Dylan walked over holding a whiskey glass. Relaxed posture. Controlled grin. Executive confidence without leadership experience. He looked at the folder, then at me. Maybe he thinks Kellogg will finally teach him personality. More laughter. I watched Patricia during the entire exchange. She said nothing. That mattered more than the jokes. I answered carefully because compliance teaches you something dangerous after enough years. The people who smile during risk creation are usually not the people who survive investigations. Education is not instability. Madison tilted her head slightly. No, but distraction is. The conversation moved on after that. Investors drifted elsewhere. Music resumed. Skyline reflections moved across the glass barriers above Seattle. But the atmosphere around me never recovered. I could feel it immediately. Corporate decisions happen silently before they happen officially. At 11:36 that night, my phone vibrated while I was inside the parking garage elevator. Human Resources. Emergency meeting request. Midnight. That told me everything. The conference room lights were still on when I arrived. A junior HR manager avoided eye contact while sliding separation paperwork across the table. Cultural misalignment. Leadership restructuring. Transition efficiency. Corporate language always becomes more polite right before betrayal. I listened without interruption. Then I noticed something strange. One document remained open on the far conference monitor. A pending Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) filing draft. My credentials were still attached to the compliance certification section. My name remained listed as Acting Chief Compliance Officer. Even after termination, I looked directly at Dylan. You missed something. He leaned back confidently. Did I? I closed the folder slowly. Federal timelines do not care about confidence. That was the only warning I gave them. Nobody in that room understood the sentence yet. That was the dangerous part. I walked out carrying my Northwestern textbooks in one hand and 20 years of regulatory memory in the other. Behind me, the conference room glass reflected executives who believed they had removed a difficult employee. What they actually removed was the only person inside Summit Financial who understood how close they already were to exposure. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you are watching from. At 4:12, every morning the apartment sounded like a law library instead of a home. Coffee machine. Laptop fan. Highlighted SEC manuals stacked beside Northwestern Kellogg coursework under a dim kitchen light. 3 days had passed since Summit Financial removed me from the company directory, not from their filings. That distinction mattered. I sat alone reviewing federal disclosure requirements while rain moved against the Seattle windows in thin gray streaks. Most people think compliance work is about regulations. It is not. Compliance is about timing. Deadlines create exposure long before fraud appears. My phone vibrated twice before sunrise. Former coworkers. Both ignored. Emotional reactions create discoverable evidence. I learned that lesson years earlier. Instead, I opened the transition email chain one more time. The message remained precise. No emotion. No hostility. Just procedure. Per SEC requirements, all uniform application for investment advisor registration and report by exempt reporting advisors records reflecting Chief Compliance Officer designation must be updated within 30 calendar days following organizational change. Failure to update supervisory responsibility records may create regulatory inconsistency. Simple language. Clear warning. Documented delivery. Dylan replied to the email 37 minutes later with one sentence. We have operational continuity handled internally. That sentence told me Madison had already taken control of compliance oversight, which meant the countdown had officially started. I returned to my Kellogg strategy assignment, while Summit Financial celebrated its restructuring across LinkedIn. Madison posted photographs from leadership meetings with captions about modernization and leadership agility. Dylan announced a new operational era focused on scalability. Patricia approved both posts publicly. Nobody mentioned federal disclosure obligations. That was the first real problem. The second problem arrived 12 days later. I discovered it accidentally while reviewing a routine SEC archive database before class. Summit Financial had submitted updated performance disclosures to investors 2 days earlier. My name remained attached to the compliance certification section. Still active, still authorized, still federally visible. I stared at the screen for almost 10 seconds without moving. That was longer than normal for me. Most executives misunderstand something dangerous about securities regulation. Systems do not care who feels powerful inside a building. Federal records only recognize documented authority structures. And Summit Financial had just submitted legal disclosures using the credentials of a terminated compliance officer, which meant one of two things was happening. Either leadership forgot to update their filings, or they believed regulators would never notice. Both explanations were catastrophic. I closed the laptop slowly and walked toward class through the wet Chicago morning air. Northwestern students moved around me, discussing valuation models and acquisition frameworks, while my former employer quietly walked toward institutional exposure without understanding it yet. That was the strange part. Nobody at Summit Financial thought they were doing something illegal. Arrogance rarely feels criminal from the inside. Around noon, another message appeared from a former analyst inside operations. Madison cannot answer basic ADV questions. I read the message once, deleted it immediately, continued walking. Distance matters during regulatory downfall, especially documented distance. That evening, I received an automated investor bulletin from Summit Financial. Quarterly performance updates, market positioning language, executive commentary, and my name again, still listed under active compliance supervision. I leaned back quietly inside the library chair while students around me prepared for presentations and recruiting interviews. Somewhere in Seattle, a federal clock continued moving toward day 30, and nobody inside Summit Financial seemed capable of hearing it. The first crack appeared inside a conference room nobody important ever noticed. 7th floor, operations wing, no windows, cold fluorescent lighting. A junior compliance analyst named Evelyn Park stopped typing halfway through a quarterly disclosure review after noticing something inconsistent inside the authorization metadata. My signature credentials were still validating active filings. That should have been impossible. Evelyn checked the submission timestamps twice before forwarding the issue internally to Madison Sullivan. The response arrived 11 minutes later. Operational continuity approved by executive leadership. Continue processing. Short message. No legal explanation. That worried Evelyn more than the discrepancy itself. By the second week after my termination, the compliance department had already started fragmenting quietly beneath the surface. Analysts delayed escalation requests because Madison answered procedural questions with management language instead of regulatory language. Internal reviews slowed down. Audit preparation became inconsistent. Small mistakes started surviving longer than usual inside the system. Most executives never understand how institutional trust actually functions. It is not charisma. It is regulatory precision repeated daily without recognition. That was the invisible layer Summit Financial had removed when they fired me. Across the country, I sat inside a Northwestern classroom reviewing governance failure case studies, while my former company unknowingly became one. Professor Elaine Whitmore discussed systemic fragility inside regulated institutions using examples from previous SEC enforcement actions. I listened carefully because real collapses rarely begin with criminal masterminds. They begin with arrogance around operational detail. My phone remained face down during class until the vibration repeated 3 times. Former coworkers again. More urgent this time. I ignored every call. Silence protects leverage. Meanwhile, inside Summit Financial, the atmosphere continued changing in subtle ways nobody at the senior management level recognized yet. Employees stopped speaking openly during meetings. Analysts began documenting conversations privately. Legal review queues expanded. Madison started redirecting difficult compliance questions toward outside counsel because she could not answer them herself. Dylan responded by increasing pressure. Everything became faster. Shorter deadlines. More reporting demands. More executive oversight meetings pretending control still existed. That only accelerated the instability. On day 19, a private equity client requested clarification regarding supervisory authority listed inside a disclosure package. The question reached Madison during an investor preparation call. She froze because she did not understand the difference between operational management and registered supervisory accountability. The distinction sounded small. Federal regulators do not consider it small. Later that afternoon, Evelyn quietly reviewed archived SEC records through the Investment Advisor Public Disclosure Database. Her expression changed immediately after seeing my status still listed as active Chief Compliance Officer under Summit Financial. Not pending removal. Not transitional. Active. She printed the record and walked directly toward Dylan's office. He barely looked at the document before answering. We already handled Michael internally. Internally was not the problem anymore. Federal systems now carried contradictory information across multiple filings tied to active investor disclosures. That was exposure. Real exposure. The dangerous kind that expands silently before executives notice movement. That night, Seattle rain covered the city in a thin gray haze while Patricia Sullivan hosted another decision-maker strategy dinner downtown celebrating operational restructuring. Investors attended. Senior partners attended. Madison smiled through photographs beside market performance charts. Nobody at the table understood the company had already entered regulatory drift. And drift becomes collapse long before panic arrives. At 9:47 the next morning, Evelyn received an external calendar request from a federal email domain. Verification review meeting. Requested by SEC Examiner James Morrison. Scheduled for day 28. At 8:53 on day 28, the elevator doors opened directly into executive reception. Nobody spoke. Even the trading monitors sounded quieter than normal. James Morrison walked through the lobby carrying a black leather portfolio case and a thin federal credentials wallet clipped beside his jacket pocket. Mid-50s. Gray suit. Controlled pace. The kind of man who never needed to raise his voice because deadlines already worked for him. The receptionist called legal immediately after seeing the badge. That was instinctive. Fear moves faster than policy inside financial firms. By the time James reached the conference level, Patricia Sullivan already stood waiting beside Dylan and Madison near the main boardroom entrance. Calm posture. Executive smiles. Controlled breathing. Only Madison looked unstable. Small things revealed it. Minimal blinking. Tightened jaw. Fingers locked too rigidly around her tablet device. James shook hands politely before opening the meeting with the exact sentence that changed the atmosphere inside Summit Financial forever. We are conducting a verification review regarding supervisory disclosure consistency under current SEC registration records. No accusation yet. That made it worse. Because regulatory language leaves executives trapped inside their own answers. The conference room remained cold enough to make the glass walls fog lightly near the corners while James opened multiple printed filings across the table. Form ADV records. Investor disclosure summaries. Compliance attestations. Quarterly reporting certifications. My name appeared repeatedly. Current Chief Compliance Officer. Active Supervisory Authority. Authorized compliance signatory. Madison shifted uncomfortably after the second document appeared. Dylan attempted to regain control immediately. Michael Richardson no longer works here. We are transitioning responsibilities internally. James looked at him for several quiet seconds before answering. Federal records disagree with that statement. Nobody moved after that, because there was no corporate language capable of softening what came next. James requested supervisory workflow documentation tied to recent filings submitted during the previous 30 days. Madison opened several folders quickly before stopping midway through a formal explanation she clearly did not understand herself. The room noticed immediately. Patricia noticed too. That was the first moment she realized the firm had not replaced expertise. It had replaced appearance. Meanwhile, I sat inside a Kellogg governance lecture reviewing institutional accountability frameworks while rain moved against the classroom windows. Professor Whitmore discussed enforcement escalation models during federal investigations. My phone vibrated continuously across the desk. 5 calls, then 7, then 11, all from Seattle. I muted the device without checking a single voicemail. Back inside Summit Financial, the review continued deteriorating. James asked Madison to explain the internal distinction between delegated operational oversight and registered supervisory accountability tied to SEC disclosure obligations. She tried answering twice. Both responses drifted into executive terminology instead of regulatory definitions. James stopped taking notes after the second attempt. That silence damaged the room more than confrontation would have. Then came the real fracture. Evelyn Park quietly handed James a printed archive copy from the SEC Public Disclosure Database, showing my status still active under Summit Financial records as of that morning. James compared the timestamp carefully against the termination date listed inside internal human resources documentation. The gap was 28 days. Exactly 28. Patricia slowly turned toward Dylan without speaking. That expression carried more pressure than yelling ever could, because everyone in the room suddenly understood the same thing simultaneously. The problem was no longer operational confusion. The firm had already submitted federally visible disclosures under regulatory authority structures that no longer legally existed. And somewhere inside Chicago, I already knew the investigation had officially begun before anyone at Summit Financial realized they were no longer controlling the situation. The projector light washed my name across the conference room wall like evidence during a federal hearing. Michael Richardson, Chief Compliance Officer, Active Supervisory Authority. Again, and again, and again. James Morrison sat near the end of the table reviewing document timestamps with the kind of patience that terrifies financial executives more than anger ever could. Every printed filing carried the same structural problem. My authority remained attached to disclosures submitted after my termination date. That changed everything inside Summit Financial instantly. The room no longer felt corporate. It felt process-driven, which meant emotions stopped matching. Patricia Sullivan requested a private decision-maker's recess 20 minutes into the review. James declined immediately. We are still gathering factual clarification. That sentence collapsed whatever illusion of control remained inside the boardroom. Dylan reacted first, not with panic, with acceleration. He started speaking faster, explaining workflow confusion, transition overlap, administrative timing delays. Every answer became more polished as the legal vulnerability became more obvious. That made James quieter. Federal investigators become quieter when explanations become too smooth. Madison barely spoke at all anymore. She sat motionless near the compliance folders with both hands locked together, while Evelyn Park quietly continued supplying archived records from internal databases. The hierarchy inside the room had already inverted. Not officially, operationally. That is how institutional collapses begin. The people with titles lose gravity first. At 2:14 in the afternoon, James requested internal supervisory communication records connected to post-termination compliance activity. Nobody answered immediately, because everyone understood what existed inside those email chains. Documented warnings, ignored procedures, executive dismissals. I was inside the Kellogg library reviewing securities governance frameworks when my former deputy compliance manager finally left a voicemail instead of another missed call. Michael, this is serious now. They are asking for supervisory communications tied to your termination timeline. Patricia looks terrified. Dylan keeps blaming operations. Madison cannot answer anything. I deleted the voicemail after listening once. Not from emotion, from discipline. Meanwhile, inside Seattle, the atmosphere inside Summit Financial continued deteriorating by the hour. Legal teams arrived on separate floors. Investor relations stopped returning external calls. Analysts quietly updated resumes between meetings. Operational staff avoided eye contact near executive offices. Everyone sensed the same thing before leadership admitted it aloud. The firm was no longer dealing with a compliance issue. It was dealing with a credibility event. And credibility collapses spread faster than financial losses. At 4:37, James placed 3 filings side by side across the conference table and asked the question that finally broke the room open. Who approved submission authority after Michael Richardson left the company? Silence. Real silence. Not strategic silence. Nobody wanted ownership anymore. Dylan finally answered by redirecting responsibility toward procedural transition assumptions made during restructuring. James wrote something down slowly after hearing that sentence. Patricia noticed immediately. Her expression changed for the first time all day. Because executives who survive long enough inside finance eventually recognize one dangerous moment during every investigation. The moment regulators stop asking exploratory questions and begin documenting accountability paths instead. That transition had just happened. Outside the building, Seattle traffic lights reflected against rain-covered pavement, while Summit Financial continued operating publicly like a stable institution. Client dashboards remained online. Investor portals still functioned. Quarterly reports still circulated externally. But inside the executive floor, something irreversible had already begun. Trust had detached from authority. And once that happens inside regulated finance, unraveling becomes regulatory instead of emotional. At 6:19 that evening, Patricia Sullivan sent me the first direct message since my termination. We need to speak immediately. At 11:48 that night, the senior management boardroom still glowed above downtown Seattle, like a ship refusing to admit it was already taking on water. Legal teams covered the conference table. Printed emails, disclosure records, internal communication timelines. Every document moved the same direction, toward accountability. James Morrison sat silently near the center of the room, reviewing metadata chains connected to internal supervisory correspondence. The SEC no longer needed theories. The documentation was beginning to organize itself. That was the terrifying part. Real investigations become dangerous when regulators stop searching for inconsistencies and start mapping intent instead. Patricia Sullivan understood that now. Dylan still did not. He continued reframing everything as administrative overlap caused by restructuring velocity. Faster speech, sharper tone, more executive vocabulary replacing factual clarity. James interrupted him only once. Was Michael Richardson aware his credentials remained attached to active filings after termination? The room tightened instantly, because everyone already knew the answer existed inside the email archive. Evelyn Park opened the transition correspondence on the main projector screen, while outside rain moved across the dark Seattle skyline in thin silver reflections. My email appeared exactly as written weeks earlier. Per SEC requirements, all supervisory designation records must be updated within 30 calendar days following organizational transition. Failure to update active compliance authority may create regulatory inconsistency. Then Dylan's response underneath it. We have operational continuity handled internally. No ambiguity. No confusion. Just documented dismissal. Madison lowered her eyes toward the conference table without speaking. Patricia remained completely motionless for almost 20 seconds while James highlighted specific timestamps inside the communication thread. That silence carried institutional weight now, because the firm could no longer argue ignorance. The warning existed. The deadlines existed. The filings existed. And my name remained attached to all of them. Meanwhile, I sat alone inside a nearly empty Kellogg study hall, reviewing governance liability frameworks for an executive ethics assignment ironically titled Leadership During Institutional Crisis. Chicago wind pressed against the library windows while my laptop screen filled with unread messages from Seattle. Most came from numbers I recognized immediately. None received answers. Distance creates clarity during collapse. Around midnight, Patricia finally reached me through direct call instead of corporate channels. I let the phone vibrate 4 times before answering. Her voice sounded older immediately, not emotional. Compressed. Michael, we need your cooperation regarding the SEC review process. I closed the textbook slowly before responding. The filing deadline was public. Silence followed. Then Patricia tried another direction. This situation escalated faster than anticipated. That sentence almost made me smile. Regulators do not move emotionally. They move procedurally, which means escalation always feels sudden to executives who ignore systems until systems become consequences. You replace compliance with optics. Another silence. Longer this time. Somewhere behind Patricia, I could hear muffled voices inside the boardroom. Lawyers. Dylan. Movement. Controlled panic disguised as strategy. Patricia lowered her voice slightly. James Morrison requested additional clarification interviews tomorrow morning. He specifically mentioned your transition warnings. Of course he did. Because warnings establish foreseeability. And foreseeability transforms mistakes into liability. I leaned back quietly inside the study chair while students nearby continued preparing presentations for leadership seminars, completely unaware that $400 million in managed assets were beginning to destabilize 2,000 miles away. Then Patricia asked the question she had spent 20 years avoiding professionally. What do you recommend we do now? That was the moment the leverage shifted permanently. Not because I raised my voice. Because the people who once mocked my MBA now needed the education they had laughed at to survive the investigation already unfolding around them. The first institutional withdrawal notice arrived at 6:13 the next morning. Then another. Then 4 more before noon. By the end of the trading day, Summit Financial had lost nearly $80 million in managed assets from clients requesting immediate transfer reviews. Not because penalties had been announced. Because confidence had started evaporating. That is what most executives never understand about regulated finance. Markets forgive losses faster than uncertainty. And Summit Financial now looked uncertain everywhere. Inside the senior management floor, the atmosphere had become clinically hostile. No raised voices anymore. No motivational language. No leadership branding. Just lawyers moving between conference rooms carrying printed liability assessments while investor relations teams struggled to contain outbound requests from institutional clients. Every conversation sounded formal now. That was how people spoke after panic matured into survival mode. Evelyn Park remained inside the compliance department long after sunset, organizing supervisory timelines for SEC follow-up requests. She noticed something disturbing while reviewing outbound client communications approved during the previous quarter. Several disclosure packets contained certification structures referencing compliance controls that technically no longer existed after my termination. The risk was widening. Not operationally. Historically. Across Chicago, I walked slowly through the Northwestern campus courtyard after finishing an leadership ethics seminar discussing governance unraveling inside legacy institutions. Cold wind moved between the stone buildings while graduate students debated leadership frameworks over coffee and recruiting offers. My phone vibrated continuously inside my coat pocket. Dylan. Patricia. Outside counsel. Unknown Seattle numbers. Ignored. The silence mattered now more than any argument ever could. At 8:21, Patricia finally sent a direct written request instead of another call. The SEC believes the supervisory inconsistencies may indicate broader governance failures. We need your cooperation before this escalates further. I read the message twice before locking the screen again. Then I entered the library. The dangerous thing about invisible people inside institutions is that executives only discover their value after removing them. By then, the leverage has already changed hands. Back in Seattle, Dylan attempted damage control during an emergency client briefing. Dark suit. Controlled tone. Executive confidence reconstructed through force of habit. He assured investors the firm remained operationally stable and fully compliant during ongoing regulatory clarification procedures. One institutional client interrupted immediately. Why did your filings still carry Michael Richardson after his termination? No polished answer existed for that question anymore. Because the issue was no longer technical. It was credibility. Dylan tried reframing the discrepancy as transitional administrative timing overlap. That explanation survived less than 30 seconds before another client requested confirmation regarding active supervisory authority signatures tied to recent disclosures. The call deteriorated after that. Not dramatically, quietly, which was worse. Professional trust rarely explodes. It drains slowly while executives continue speaking as if nothing changed. Later that night, Patricia requested a private meeting through outside counsel. Neutral location. No attorneys present initially. She emphasized urgency 3 separate times inside the email. I responded 27 minutes later with one sentence. I warned all of you already. No anger. No revenge language. Just fact. Meanwhile, James Morrison submitted preliminary escalation recommendations directly to regional SEC leadership based on supervisory inconsistency findings and internal decision-makers' communications. Evelyn learned about the escalation accidentally after overhearing outside counsel discussing enforcement probability percentages near the elevator lobby. 90% likelihood of formal action. That number spread internally faster than any official announcement. By midnight, nearly half the senior analysts inside Summit Financial had privately contacted recruiters. Investors continued requesting transfer documentation. Patricia stopped appearing on internal video calls entirely. Madison had not entered the compliance floor since the investigation expanded. And somewhere between Seattle and Chicago, the institution that once mocked my MBA had already become a live governance failure case study before anyone officially admitted the collapse had started. Camera flashes turned the Summit Financial press conference into something colder than humiliation. Documentation. Exposure. Institutional failure recorded permanently. Patricia Sullivan stood behind the podium wearing the same controlled expression she once used during quarterly investor calls. But executive confidence behaves differently after federal findings become public. The pauses grow longer. The breathing changes. Even silence starts sounding expensive. By then, the SEC enforcement action had already circulated across every major financial publication before sunrise. Supervisory disclosure failures. Inaccurate filings. Governance deficiencies. Internal compliance breakdowns. $850,000 in penalties. Nearly $400 million in withdrawn assets. 3 institutional partnerships suspended indefinitely pending independent review. And worst of all for Summit Financial, the market no longer trusted leadership competence. That damage lasts longer than fines. Reporters shouted questions from the back of the room, while Patricia read the resignation statement prepared overnight by outside counsel. Her voice remained measured until someone mentioned my name directly. Then came the hesitation. Small. Visible. Enough. Because everyone following the investigation already understood the central irony behind the failure. The only person who actually tried preventing the crisis had been removed for cultural misalignment. Across Seattle, former employees watched the conference stream quietly from coffee shops, office lobbies, and recruiter meetings. Some looked shocked. Others did not. Most already knew Summit Financial operated on invisible labor carried by people executives rarely respected publicly. The SEC investigation simply forced that truth into documentation. Inside the compliance division, Evelyn Park completed her final transition interview with federal investigators late that afternoon. She answered carefully. No exaggeration. No emotional commentary. Just timelines. Procedures. Escalation records. That was enough. Real collapses rarely required dramatic witnesses. Only organized facts. Dylan Sullivan disappeared from public communication entirely after enforcement details became official. Internal sources claimed he attempted negotiating private retention protections through outside counsel before the board rejected additional decision-makers' compensation requests. Nobody protected him anymore. Not because executives suddenly discovered ethics. Because leverage had shifted completely away from leadership. Madison resigned 2 days later through a short legal statement referencing personal reasons and transitional restructuring priorities. Financial media interpreted the language exactly how everyone expected. Avoidance. Distance. Containment. Meanwhile, I sat inside a Northwestern faculty conference room reviewing guest lecture proposals for the next academic semester. Governance failure. Institutional accountability. Regulatory culture breakdown inside modern finance. Real case studies. Real exposure patterns. Real consequences. Professor Whitmore closed the folder slowly before looking at me across the table. Most executives study leadership backward. She was right. They study visibility, not responsibility. That was how firms like Summit Financial destroy themselves while believing they are modernizing. By removing competence that feels inconvenient politically. Later that evening, I walked alone beside Lake Michigan while Chicago wind pushed against the dark water in steady cold waves. My phone remained almost silent for the first time in weeks. No emergency calls. No executive messages. No legal escalation requests. The collapse had finished organizing itself. That was the strange thing about the entire situation. I never attacked Summit Financial. I never exposed confidential information. I never sabotaged systems. I simply left after documenting the truth properly. The institution did the rest alone. Because arrogance becomes operational risk the moment leadership starts confusing loyalty with competence. And once regulators begin measuring reality instead of executive narratives, institutions discover very quickly which employees were actually holding the structure together the entire time. 1 year later, the lecture hall filled 30 minutes before class started. Not because students love compliance, because collapse attracts attention when the numbers become public enough. Northwestern Kellogg projected the case study title across the auditorium screen, while graduate students opened laptops beneath soft overhead lighting. Governance failure inside modern financial institutions. No company logo appeared. It did not need to. Everyone in the room already knew the story. I stood near the front row reviewing discussion notes while conversations moved quietly across the auditorium. Some students came from investment banking, others from consulting, private equity, asset management. Future executives preparing for careers inside the same kind of institutions that once believed expertise was replaceable if the right family member wanted authority badly enough. That was the dangerous illusion. I walked toward the center stage exactly at 6 o'clock. No dramatic entrance. No performance energy. Just preparation. My name is Michael Richardson. 45 years old. 21 years inside securities regulation. Former chief compliance officer. Current governance consultant. The room became still immediately. Not because of status. Because calm people sound different after surviving institutional failure. Behind me, the first slide appeared on the projection screen. A timeline. Executive restructuring. Filing inconsistencies. SEC review escalation. Asset withdrawals. Leadership resignations. No emotional language. Just sequence. That mattered more. I spent the next 90 minutes walking students through the exact mechanics that destroyed Summit Financial. Not market volatility. Not recession pressure. Not cyber attacks. Arrogance. Slow procedural arrogance repeated long enough to become operational legal pressure. Several students expected dramatic revenge details. They never arrived. Because real institutional collapses are rarely cinematic from the inside. They happen through ignored warnings. Delayed accountability. Executive overconfidence. Small regulatory shortcuts repeated under pressure until systems stop trusting leadership completely. Near the end of the lecture, a student in the second row raised her hand carefully. Did you know the company would downfall after they fired you? I looked toward the projection screen before answering. No. I knew they stopped respecting reality. That answer stayed in the room quietly for several seconds. Because everyone understood the difference. The danger was never my departure itself. The danger was leadership believing competence could be replaced by proximity, loyalty, and executive image management. Outside the lecture hall, Chicago, snow moved lightly across the campus sidewalks while students slowly packed laptops and notebooks into bags. Several remained afterward asking questions about governance risk and regulatory culture. Others requested consulting contact information. One professor invited me to participate in a financial ethics symposium the following spring. That was the final irony. The MBA they mocked as unprofessional became the foundation of my second career after their unraveling funded the lesson. Later that evening, I walked alone through the quiet campus courtyard, carrying the same Northwestern folder Madison Sullivan once laughed at during the rooftop party in Seattle. The edges looked worn now. Creased corners. Marked pages. Real use. I stopped briefly beneath the winter lights near the stone archway outside the business school and checked my phone one last time before heading home. No emergency messages. No executive panic. No legal escalation requests. Just silence. Clean silence. The kind earned after truth finishes organizing itself completely. Most companies do not collapse because competitors are stronger. They break down because leadership learns too late that invisible expertise was the only thing holding the structure together.